And we will now have our first reading, which is going to be a reading about Mabon, and Ben is kindly going to read this for us.
This is Mabon, or the Autumn Equinox, from the Goddess and Green Man website. This festival is now named after the god of Welsh mythology, Mabon. In this mythology, he is the child of light and the son of the Earth Mother Goddess, Modron. In truth, there is little evidence that Mabon was celebrated in Celtic countries, and the term Mabon was applied as recently as the 1970s, all part of our reconstructed paganism. Here is another point of perfect balance on the journey through the wheel of the year, its counterpart being Ostara, or the spring equinox. Night and day are again of equal length and in perfect equilibrium, dark and light, masculine and feminine, inner and outer in balance. But we are again on the cusp of transition, and from now the year begins to wane, and from this moment darkness begins to take over from light. The cycle of the natural world is moving towards completion. The sun's power is waning, and from now on, the nights grow longer and the days are shorter and cooler. The sap of trees returns back to their roots deep in the earth, changing the green of summer to the fire of autumn, to the flaming reds, oranges, and golds. We are returning to the dark from whence we came. But before we do that, we're going to party again. This is the second harvest, the fruit harvest, and the great feast of Thanksgiving. The first harvest is Lammas, the grain harvest on 1st of August, and the third is the nuts and berries harvest of Samhain on 31st October. The goddess is radiant as harvest queen, and the god finally dies with his gift of pure love with the cutting of the last grain. He will return. As the grain harvest is safely gathered in from Lammas and reaches completion, we enjoy the abundance of fruit and vegetables at this time. It is time to thank the waning sun for the wealth of harvest bestowed upon us. It sometimes seems that each festival requires the making of celebration and the giving of thanks, but this really is so, as each turn of the wheel brings both inner and outer gifts and insights. The cornucopia, or horn of plenty, is a traditional symbol for Mabon. It is a wonderful symbol for the wealth of harvest and is a beautifully balanced symbol which is both male and female. So Mabon is a celebration and also a time of rest after the labor of harvest. In terms of life path, it is the moment of reaping what you have sown, time to look at the hopes and aspirations of Imbolc and Ostara and reflect on how they have manifested. It is time to complete projects, to clear out and let go that which is no longer wanted or needed as we prepare for descent, so that winter can offer a time for reflection and peace. And it is time to plant seeds of new ideas and hopes which will lie dormant but nourished in the dark until the return of spring.
And we have a prayer for this time of the year, written by the Reverend Tony McNeil for the Unitarian Earth Spirit Network. Tony writes, "Greetings to everyone from the end of the September 2022, and in a time of uncertainty, here are some words from our Wheel of the Year card. The autumn equinox sun reaches its point of balance, the corn is gathered in, the fruit harvest hangs ready for picking soon. The time of daylight and the time of darkness rest against one another. All is fulfilled and the winter rest approaches. The horn of plenty, the cornucopia, is full. Let the ground rest. Clear away what has died and process it back to the elements and so to the earth. The wheel turns on to rest, to the birth of life again. This is the time for reflecting upon the year of your life. This is the time of preparation for peace and the time for rest. Look back at the equinox of spring. What did we sow and what have we reaped? What plants have borne fruit and what has not grown? Let us rejoice in the positive and take what has failed to be burnt upon the fire of experience to clear the ground for what will be new again as the wheel turns. Leave the way clear, clean, and ready for the new year that will return. May it be so. Amen. The wheel is turning. There is a crispness to the air and a slight chill, which is especially noticeable when you get off the plane at Manchester Airport at 3 in the morning, I can tell you. Yes. So yes, the wheel is turning. We're now in autumn. Winter approaches. This next reading is perhaps an unusual one for the harvest service, since it's from the book Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. I'll be talking a bit more about this if you're not familiar with the book. It's actually written for Terry Pratchett's fantasy equivalent of Father Christmas. Now that might seem an odd one for the harvest service, but stick with me and I think it will make sense. So this is a reading in which Susan, Death's granddaughter, explores Death's library. There was a bickering behind Susan as she sought along the shelves in the canyons of Death's huge library, which was so big that clouds would form in it if they dared. Said Susan under her breath. The Hogfather. He had several shelves, not just one book. The first volume seemed to have been written upon a roll of animal skin. The Hogfather was old. Okay, how does it look? She unrolled the scroll. Maybe I should sit on a snowy log, mumbled the raven behind her. That's probably the trick, right enough. I can't read this, said Susan. The letters are all odd. Ethereal runes, said the raven. The Hogfather ain't human after all. Susan ran her hands over the thin leather. The shapes flowed around her fingers. She could not read them, but she could feel them. There was the sharp smell of snow, so vivid that her breath condensed in the air. There were sounds, hooves, the snap of branches in a cold forest, and a bright shining light. She jerked awake and thrust the scroll aside. She unrolled the next one, which looked as though it was made out of strips of bark. Characters hovered over the surface. Whatever they were, they had not really been designed to be read by the eye. You could believe they were a braille for the touching mind. Images ribboned across her senses: wet fur, sweat, pine, soot, cold air, the tang of damp ash, pig manure, her governess mind hastily corrected. There was blood and the taste of beans. It was all images without words, almost animal. But none of this is right. Everyone knows he's a jolly old fat man who goes around handing out presents to kids, she said aloud. Is, not was. You know how it is. Fingernail, always fighting to find the way back in. Once a god, always a god. Dead, perhaps, but only like the world in winter. And now, candles of joy and concern. At this time in our service, we pause to reflect upon our week. We recall the milestones, the joys, concerns, and sorrows, changes in our lives, those who need our healing thoughts. It's autumn, as we've all noticed of late. The leaves turn, there's the chill in the air, and pumpkins appear in the shops, and indeed in my next door neighbour's garden. So naturally, earlier, I read an extract from Terry Pratchett's Hogfather, which deals with Christmas. Or does it? For those unfamiliar with Pratchett's works, his fiction was set in a world known as the Discworld, which consisted of a huge disk of earth, water, and air, travelling through space balanced on the back of 4 elephants, which in turn stood upon the back of the gigantic world turtle, Great Atuin. It will perhaps surprise no one to learn that the most common element in Pratchett's world was not earth, fire, air, or water, but narrativium. The basic building block of everything on the Discworld, the imaginary element ensured that everything that happened there ran properly as a story. For example, if a boy on the Discworld had 2 elder brothers, the chances are they would go on a quest. The first would be strong and fail because of his stupidity. The second would be smart and fail because of his frailty. And then the younger brother would have no choice but to go out, succeed, and bring fame and fortune to his poor family. This was rather a rough deal on the first and second brothers, but unfortunately stories aren't always very nice. Pratchett, the master storyteller, once wrote, "Our minds make stories, and stories make our minds." Each culture's Make a Human Being kit is built from stories and maintained by them. A story can be a rule for living according to one's culture, a useful survival trick, a clue to the grandeur of the universe, or a mental hypothesis about what might happen were we to pursue a particular course. Stories map out the phased space of our existence. It's rather interesting that Pratchett, who was famously a patron of the British Humanists Association, is an author much loved by Unitarians who may or may not be humanists themselves. Why mention this now in the harvest service? We heard earlier in the extract about the origins of the Mabon autumn equinox celebration, that the term Mabon was first applied to the autumn equinox celebration in the 1970s, as far as anyone knows, and the authors openly refer to our reconstructed paganism. Anyone with even a passing interest in paganism is aware that attempting to draw a clear line between the pagan practices of earlier cultures and modern paganism is at best very difficult. There is little written evidence that has survived of what people believed and did in earlier pagan cultures, unlike, for example, the Romans and Greeks, whose religious practices were very well documented. Artifacts have survived, but without any great memory of the culture that gave birth to them, it's not always clear what they meant, what the significance was for those who used them. I don't describe myself as pagan, but I don't actually have any problem with this position in general. I find myself in the interesting position of both believing in a god, a deity, and also believing that most religious practices, and indeed most religions, are essentially made up by humans to a greater or lesser extent. I would defend this by making the observation that if God, in whom I personally do believe, is indeed the maker of all things, near and far, then as humans we can only ever have a very partial understanding of divine reality. A human mind, I think, cannot fully comprehend the being that made the entire universe that existed before we evolved upon this garden planet, that should we go extinct will continue to exist long after we've gone. If anyone listening does not themselves believe in such a creator deity, you might like to try comprehending the laws of physics, biology and chemistry that underpin our universe, the origins of our universe, its unimaginable age and the gigantic distances between the stars and galaxies, and what we know about its likely end in a truly gigantic amount of time. I think you will achieve much the same effect. We can, I think, try with words and with our art to try and explain our experiences with and of the divine, and indeed achieve some greater knowledge and understanding. If I didn't believe that, I would be wasting mine and everybody else's time by standing here. But I do think that all human language is necessarily somewhat partial. I've read translations of the Quran and the Hindu Vedas, but whilst they were magnificent and enlightening, I was always aware that there seemed to be some key elements, some essence missing, that without myself being rooted in the original language and culture that these great religious writings originated from, my comprehension was not complete. For example, I do not speak or read or understand Arabic, and anyone who knows the Quran would say that it is best read in its original language to fully understand what is meant by the words. Somewhat nearer to home, there are over 100 English translations of the Bible, as far as anyone knows. Trying to sit down and count them would take a while, and they are really not all the same. If you'll forgive the Sunday school joke, anyone who's ever compared the New International Version of Ezekiel chapter 23, verses 16 to 23, with the modern English version will appreciate the point. Feel free to Google that later. Pratchett, as we've heard earlier, was a great believer in stories as one of the defining characteristics of human beings, the way in which we make sense of our world. And I personally don't believe that religion is only story. I do think there is that divine truth within it. For me, that comes from an encounter with the divine without. For others, it may be the divine within. Which brings us to the harvest service. If you know your history, you know that the tradition of celebrating harvest in churches as we know it today in the UK began in 1843, when the Reverend Robert Hawker invited parishioners in a special Thanksgiving service for the harvest at his church at Morwenstow in Cornwall. Victorian hymns such as "We plough the fields and scatter," "Come, ye thankful people, come," "All things bright and beautiful," helped to popularise his idea of the harvest festival and spread the annual custom of decorating churches with homegrown produce for the harvest festival service. There were other similar traditions taking place in the United States around the same time. Those were inspired partly by English traditions, also by Dutch and German and the many cultures that migrated to America. It might be interesting to look at those sometime, but for now, thinking about our own celebrations here in the UK, Harvest Festival as we know it originated then. And I do think it's interesting that that coincided with a time when the Industrial Revolution was in full force and society was changing very rapidly. But there are documented examples of earlier harvest traditions, hopefully not quite so grim as some of those touched upon in the Hogfather reading. Although, as we say, we don't fully know what people did as religious practices in earlier cultures on our isles. Sometimes we might not want to. But nearer to our current era, at the start of the harvest, communities would appoint a strong and respected man of the village as their lord of the harvest. He would be responsible for negotiating the harvest wages and organising the field workers. And it was his responsibility to bring the last snook, which was a sheaf of corn, back to a farm to officially declare the harvest safely gathered in before the supper started. The end of harvest in many places was celebrated with a big meal called a harvest supper, eaten on the Christian festival of Michaelmas Day. The Lord of the harvest would sit at the end of the table. A goose stuffed with apples was eaten, along with a variety of vegetables. Goose fairs were, and still in some places are, held in English towns at this time of the year. I have in fact produced an apple cake. It's sitting at the back on a plate, made with some apples from a friend's garden. You will have your orders of service, and if you have looked at the photograph on the front, you will note that it's perhaps a rather interesting one for the harvest service. That is actually my best friend's kitchen window, filled with the results of a harvest from the allotment. I have no idea what she'll do with all the marrows, but I'm thinking marrow chutneys in the future. You might also have spotted on the inset a postbox topper from Heaton, depicting many animals from this time of the year. And this is, I think, an owl, not a wren. So where does this leave us now? We don't live in the predominantly agricultural world that our not so distant ancestors did. Instead, we live in a world where we are increasingly aware that the notion that modern society has done away with our dependence on the natural world, that we live in a world of infinite resources, we are increasingly aware that that is a complete fiction. Our dependence has not gone away. We need clean air, clean water, and good harvests exactly as much as our ancestors did. Thus, the Harvest Festival morphs and changes from an annual celebration of the success of a community's labour in bringing in enough food to get through the winter, to a reminder that we depend on the changing seasons, the wheel of the year, and the natural processes that produce clean air, water, and food as much as ever. We need the Harvest Festival as much as we ever did and ever will. I've put out the physical flame of our chalice, but its light remains within us until we gather once more. A final prayer, a prayer for abundance by Unitarian Universalist Patty Wigington. We have so much before us, and for this we are thankful. We have so many blessings, and for this we are thankful. There are others not so fortunate, and by this we are humbled. We shall make an offering in their name and pray to that we hold to be divine, that those in need are some day as blessed as we are this day. Let us go forth in love and give abundantly.